Hello, my friends! Today we're going to talk about how to make time to study, especially if you're not a student, you have a full-time job, and you are trying to self-study something on your own. So not studying something because school or work is forcing you to do it. So this might be something like learning a new language or improving your writing skills or basically anything that you want to learn to do. First, who am I and why am I making this video? As you might have guessed, I'm not a student. I work a full-time job and I study almost every day. I have been studying Korean for about an hour a day, 5 days a week for the last 2.5 years, which yes, great, everyone cheer for me now. But that is a very recent development, and before then, it was a struggle. I'm half Korean, and I didn't learn the language growing up, so I had been trying to self-study Korean for literally decades with no success until 2.5 years ago when I tried once again, and that attempt worked. I was able to stick to a consistent routine, and I've been able to study Korean quite consistently for the last 2.5 years. So you are probably wondering, what changed? Like, did I suddenly grow as a person? Did I just gain more discipline or just push myself harder to just force myself to study even when I felt like didn't really want to? And the answer is no. No personal growth happened. No discipline was gained, and in retrospect, it's actually really clear what the problem was. Quite simply, I did not know how to self-study, and purely by accident, in my latest attempt to self-study Korean, I figured it out. Self-studying itself is a skill, and most of us are never taught how to self-study. We go through years and years of school, not self-directed, you have to do it, and so it's actually, in a lot of ways, the direct opposite of self-studying. And not only are we never taught how to self-study, we don't even realize that that's a skill to be learned. Most times, if someone's trying to start learning a new thing, like learning Korean, and they just can't seem to get themselves to study, we deem this a personal failure. This is a lack of discipline rather than a lack of skill or a lack of mastery of the skill of self-studying. And we don't do this with other skills. If I'm trying to paint for the first time and I realize gosh, it's really hard to hold the paintbrush right. We're really having trouble painting this picture and making it look like the thing I'm trying to get it to look like. We don't deem this a personal failure. Okay, if you just tried harder, you're going to paint better. It's yeah, painting is skill. Yeah, you had to learn it. You had to practice, etc., etc. So with self-studying, it's a skill just like any other skill. Just like with painting, there's techniques to self-studying, recommended practices and not so recommended practices. So that is why I wanted to create this video series. I wanted to try to teach you how to self-study. So this is going to be a whole series, but today we are just going to focus on how to make time to study, which I'm super excited to talk about because I actually think this is probably 90% of your battle, is finding and making the time to study and committing to showing up to that study session. So now let's get started. If you want to start a study routine or any new routine, really, you're going to need to make time for it. What do I mean by that though? What does it mean to actually make time for something? Well, different people have different definitions, but when I say you should make time for studying, I mean you should literally schedule your study sessions with a concrete time and place, the way that you would schedule any other event in your life that you actually show up to. So a dinner with friends, or a meeting with coworkers, or a wedding. These things that are important to you and these things that you actually do, you tend to define specifically what time you're showing up, what day you're showing up, where you're showing up, and about how long the event is going to be. So similarly, if you want your study session to actually happen, you should schedule your study sessions accordingly. So the flip side of this means you should not try to just study whenever you feel like it. And I want to kind of belabor this point a little bit. So why am I insisting that you schedule your study sessions? That rather than just saying, I'm just gonna study whenever the inspiration strikes, or, I'm just gonna study sometime today. I'm no, you should actually be I'm going to study at 7 a.m. today on my couch on Monday, Wednesday, Friday? Like, why am I recommending that you be that concrete? So to be totally clear, if you have a flexible study schedule and if that is already working for you, like if you've been consistently studying for, let's just say, 6 months or longer by just going like, I'm just gonna study whenever I feel like it, or like, I just try to find time in my week to study. Again, if you can actually do that, keep going. Like, don't change anything. There's nothing inherently better or worse about like a concrete schedule or a flexible schedule, other than I've found in practice that a rigid schedule is going to help you stick to it better. So I told you already, I have tried and failed to self-study Korean for like decades, and I would always try to be really lenient with my study schedule. I would be like, okay, I'm going to try to study Korean sometime today, or I'm going to try to study Korean for 2 hours this weekend. And I was doing that for a good reason. Like, I assumed that if I had a flexible schedule, that would make me more likely to do it because it wouldn't feel like a chore. I wouldn't like be forcing myself to do things. Instead, I've been like sort of following my own natural energy levels, whatever, and it would help me to like stick to the routine and not burn out. And so very good intentions. The only problem is it never worked for me. Like 100% of the time when I tried to have a flexible study schedule, I just wouldn't do it. Even if I managed to find the motivation 2 days in a row to like just happen to get the desire to study sometime during the day, have that time to study, and then actually study, like even if that happened once or twice, I could not sustainably continue that. And it would just end up being the end of the day, and I'd be like, oh, I guess I didn't study again, and I wouldn't study, and then I would just give up. Yeah, looking back, like one of the biggest differences between me now, someone who is able to easily study Korean an hour a day, 5 days a week, and me of the past who could not imagine doing such a thing, is moving to a fixed schedule rather than a flexible schedule. So at this point, you might be wondering, like, wait, why did it take you so long to try this? And I was doing some thinking of my own on this, and I think it's because this is the opposite of what I did in school. And I think it's the opposite of what most of us do in school. When I was in school, I had a completely inconsistent, completely chaotic study schedule. Like, I'd come home from school and I just procrastinate super hard. Like, I'd hang out with friends or watch a K-drama or just like click things on the internet until it was like 9 or 10, and I'd be like, oh boy, okay, let me go do my homework now. And then I would concentrate really hard and get through that homework as quickly as I could. So in other words, for my entire academic life, I thrived with having a really flexible schedule and then having a really rigorous study session. Since that worked so well for me in school, I think I was just sort of naturally trying to apply that to self-studying. So like, why did this work so well for me in an academic setting, but completely failed for me when self-studying? A big difference is that school, at least K through 12 in the US, is mandatory. You literally have to go to school. And even beyond like the literal government mandate, there are other consequences if you don't turn in your homework or if you don't study for a test. And so for me, that desire to get a good grade was always enough to motivate me to get my work done at a high quality level, no matter what. So I could have a totally flexible, totally chaotic schedule because I would always still get my work done by the deadline because that like motivation was so strong for me. So now let's compare that with self-studying. Self-studying is completely optional. There are no deadlines and there are no consequences if you don't do it. Or it's more like if you don't do it, nothing changes, which is actually the consequence. So therefore, with self-studying, the most common failure mode is you just don't do it because there's nothing forcing you to do it. No government body or future decisions that will change depending on whether or not I choose to self-study Korean. And I think this difference is why I really strongly recommend you do not take the same strategy you took for school studying toward self-studying. even if this worked well for you in school, it's relying on the assumption like, well, I'm going to do it eventually. Which again, might have been a fair assumption in school, but is a poor assumption for self-studying because it's completely volitional. For self-studying, you want to actually take the opposite approach, which is to commit to a rigid time frame. So if hearing the words like a rigid study schedule gets you to tense up a bit, like, I don't want this to feel like a chore, I don't want to feel like I'm forcing myself to study, or like, I'm really worried about burning out with studying. This is a great concern to have, but my suggestion is that rather than making your study schedule flexible, you should make your study session flexible. So I think of the act of studying in two different parts. There's your study schedule, which is like the when and where and what days you're going to study. And then there's your study session, which is what are you actually going to do during your study session. And with your study schedule or with your study session, you could be either really flexible or really rigid. So I actually put this on a 2x2 matrix, where in one direction we're going from a flexible study session to a more rigorous study session, and in the other direction we're going from a flexible study schedule to a rigid study schedule. And what I am saying right now is that the sort of Goldilocks quadrant that you want to be in is the rigid study schedule with a flexible study session. As an example, this might look like at 6 a.m. every weekday, I'll sit at my desk and study Korean slowly for an hour. So notice in this example, I've concretely defined when, what days, where, and how long I'm going to study, but I've been super unspecific with what exactly I'm going to do. And that example that I talked about with school, where I would procrastinate on homework until like 9 p.m. and then really concentrate and get my homework done quickly, that's more in this quadrant where I had a flexible study schedule, but a really rigorous study session. And again, that worked well for me in school, but as you see, it is the opposite of what you want to do for self-studying. So, okay, I just made an impassioned argument for why you should have a concrete, specific study schedule as opposed to a vague and flexible one. So I hope you're convinced on the why. I'm now going to go over the how, like how to actually make a study schedule. So step one, I want you to write out your current schedule, like in general, how do you spend your day? If you don't feel like you have a regular schedule, then I want you to right now start tracking how you spend your time for the next 24 to 48 hours. And I also recommend you do this on a physical piece of paper, and you can keep it with you throughout your day so it serves as a little reminder to keep jotting down what you're doing every hour of the day. Step two, now I want you to think about what is your ideal study schedule. So how long do you think you want to study for? How often do you want to do it? And where do you want to study? You actually don't have to figure out when yet because we'll do that in the next step. So take a moment to write this all down on another piece of paper. It might look something like this. Maybe you want to study an hour a day, Monday through Friday, at home, at your desk. Step 3, schedule your study sessions. So the thing about making time for something is there are only 24 hours in a day, and you are currently occupying all of them. So the only way to make time for something is to replace something that's already in that 24-hour time pie with your new thing. And here's how you do it. I want you to take your ideal study session from step 2 and your daily schedule from step 1 and just kind of play around with it and see where you can fit in your study time. Here's just a quick example of what that might look like. So using that daily routine from step 1, I'm going to add my study routine in the mornings, and I'm going to adjust my wake up time and my bedtime to account for this. As you're doing this, here's one thing I strongly recommend that you do. Add buffer time. I actually recommend that you add 30 minutes, if not an hour of buffer time. That means if you want to study for an hour, I'm saying you should actually schedule 2 hours for your study session, an hour of buffer time and an hour for the study time. Why am I recommending this? So remember, you add buffer time to every other activity that you actually do. Like if you make plans to get lunch with a friend in the middle of your workday, you're not going to only account for the time you physically spend in the restaurant. You're going to add time for traveling to and from the restaurant. And you've probably already noticed in your real life, if you don't add enough buffer time for getting to an appointment on time, it's really stressful. You're like rushing, you're scrambling, you're like, okay, do I need to like call and tell them I'm going to be late? And it's just like not a great experience. And the same goes for studying. If you only reserve 1 hour for studying and you're trying to study for an hour, like you've got to be so on top of things to actually be able to study a full hour's time. On the other hand, if you allocate 2 hours of time for your 1 hour of studying, you can take your time, you can get a coffee, you can procrastinate up to an entire hour and still have an entire hour left for your studying. That is why I highly recommend that you add buffer time when scheduling your study session. So I think many of you, when you do this exercise, should be able to find some free time in your schedule where you can pencil in your study time. But that also might not happen. A very possible and very valid outcome of this exercise is that you look at your schedule realistically and you're like, I don't think I have time to study right now. If you find that even when you pare your study routine down to the smallest possible little sliver, if you still can't find a way to put it into your schedule, that's okay. So rather than forcing yourself to study when you truly are at capacity and do not have time to study, I'm suggesting that you essentially hit the snooze button on this. And by that I mean, you can set a calendar event or another form of reminder for yourself to try this exercise again and see if at that time it might be a better time for you to start a new study routine. All right, now final step, step 4. Add reminders for yourself for everything. And you should do that using whatever scheduling tools that are currently working for you. So suppose if you got a save the date for a wedding, how would you remember to go to the wedding? Or let's say you have a job interview. What do you do to make sure you remember the date and time of that job interview? You should apply that same tool, that same technique to these adjustments you are making to your daily schedule. And using this example here, notice that I've changed the time that I get up in the morning, so I'm going to need to set an alarm for that. I've also changed my bedtime, so I'm also going to set an alarm for that. And finally, I've added in this study time, so I'm going to create a calendar event for studying. And that was the final step. So congratulations, you have officially made time for studying. You might be wondering now, like, how do I get myself to actually show up? And what should I actually do during my study sessions? A great question. That will actually be the topic of my next video in this series. In the meantime, this is Self-Study 101. This is a class after all. So I am also going to be giving you some homework to complete before now and the next video. Here's your homework. Do this exercise to make time to study. If you have time to just make your study schedule right now, after this video, do it. But if you don't, I want you to instead plan when you're going to make time to study. So like actually schedule when you're going to schedule your study session. Try to complete this before watching the next video in the series. And there you have it. We have reached the end of this video. We just covered how to make time to self-study, and this is part of a series, Self-Study 101, where I'm going to be going over every single step of how to self-study on your own. If there are any particular videos you'd want to see, or things that you find really tough about self-studying, please comment below and let me know. And if these tips helped you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel where I will be giving you more tips on self-studying, language learning, and creative projects. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!